California's coastline rose 6 feet in a single night. 400 miles of land from San Francisco to Los Angeles just lifted while the world slept. There was no earthquake, no volcanic eruption, no warning whatsoever. Every sensor from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to municipal GPS networks confirmed the same impossible reading. What should take thousands of years happened in hours, and geologists are arguing over whether this is catastrophic land movement or the greatest data failure in scientific history. But here's what keeps experts awake at night. They cannot explain what caused it, and the land is still rising. By sunrise, container ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars were stranded on exposed mudflats at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. The nation's busiest trade gateway, handling $1.4 billion in cargo every single day, was completely cut off from the Pacific Ocean. Dock workers stood on piers that now towered uselessly above vessels that couldn't reach them. And while port officials were trying to process what had happened, marine biologists 300 miles north were watching tide pools that had existed for generations bake in the sun, cut off from the ocean that had sustained them for thousands of years. Starfish, anemones, crabs, all of them dying in real time as the living edge of California's coastline was pushed violently out of reach. But the crisis unfolding at ground level was nothing compared to what scientists were seeing in the data, because the numbers they were looking at shouldn't exist. California's coast sits where two massive tectonic plates meet, the Pacific and the North American, and they've been grinding against each other for millions of years. The land does move, but at a pace so glacial, you'd need several human lifetimes to notice even a few inches of change. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory has instruments sensitive enough to detect ground movement thinner than a fingernail, and they've been tracking this coastline with extraordinary precision for decades. What they've consistently measured in Santa Barbara is about 2 to 3 millimeters of uplift per year, roughly the thickness of 2 credit cards stacked together, and that takes 12 full months to accumulate. In Long Beach, human activities like pumping groundwater or extracting oil sometimes nudge the land up by a few centimeters over the course of an entire year, but it's always gradual and completely predictable. Most of California's coast is actually sinking rather than rising, because groundwater drainage and sediment compaction beneath sprawling cities pull the land downward faster than the ocean itself is rising. Marine Gavorsian, a remote sensing scientist at JPL, explained that in many parts of the world, especially the reclaimed ground beneath San Francisco, the land is moving down faster than the sea itself is going up. This slow, steady rhythm of millimeters per year is what geologists consider normal. It's the baseline they've confirmed through decades of satellite data, ground-based GPS readings, and tide gauges. So when GPS stations up and down the coast started reporting a 6-foot vertical jump in a single night, it wasn't just the measurements that were alarming, it was what those measurements meant. In Santa Barbara, the most dramatic uplift ever recorded topped out at 3 millimeters per year. Even the rare documented cases of human-caused uplift from groundwater recharge or fluid injection barely pushed the land up by a centimeter or two over an entire year. 6 feet overnight contradicted everything scientists understand about how the Earth works. And by mid-morning, as emergency rescue teams were scrambling to save stranded seabirds and seals along beaches from Monterey to San Diego, engineers at JPL were pulling raw data files with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. These monitoring systems aren't some hobbyist setup. We're talking about NASA, the United States Geological Survey, GPS stations that feed data to satellite radar systems and tide gauges, all of it cross-validated by teams of specialists who've spent their entire careers perfecting these measurements. The probability of every single system malfunctioning in exactly the same way at exactly the same time is so astronomically low, it's essentially impossible. But what's the alternative? That the land actually rose? When Marine Gavorsian first saw the data, she said something that captured the magnitude of what they were facing. If these numbers are real, we're not just rewriting textbooks, we're questioning the ground we stand on. There's really only 2 types of natural events that can move the Earth this much this quickly, and those are massive earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. The seismic networks that monitor every tremor along the California coast were completely silent. There were no rumbles, no vibrations, not even the faintest blip on any seismometer. The land apparently just rose quietly, uniformly, all at once across hundreds of miles. While insurance companies were realizing that their policies covering earthquakes and tsunamis were worthless for a disaster that had no name and no precedent, scientists found themselves stuck between two possibilities that were equally hard to accept. Either the world's most sophisticated geological monitoring network had suffered a catastrophic failure on a scale never witnessed before, or something was happening to the planet that nobody could explain. The audit began with a single question: could any of the data be trusted? Engineers at JPL pulled the raw RINEX files from every GPS station that reported the anomaly. These files are basically the unfiltered, time-stamped backbone of any vertical motion analysis, and they cross-reference everything against station logs, antenna specifications, maintenance records, even the soil composition beneath each monitoring station's concrete base. One early theory was that maybe there had been some kind of subtle shift in the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, the global coordinate system that all GPS measurements rely on. If that framework had quietly realigned, it could theoretically create the illusion of the ground suddenly jumping upward. They checked it thoroughly and found nothing wrong. By noon, the death toll among coastal marine life was climbing into the hundreds of thousands. Volunteers with buckets and wet towels were working alongside marine biologists from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but the scale of the crisis was overwhelming them. For every animal they managed to rescue and relocate, dozens more died. And in conference rooms across California, the atmospheric interference theory was collapsing. Storms or solar activity can sometimes introduce several centimeters of measurement error through tropospheric and ionospheric distortion. The team pored over atmospheric correction tables, looking for any spikes that might explain what they were seeing, but the supposed 6-foot uplift was orders of magnitude larger than any known atmospheric artifact could possibly produce. They moved on to more technical possibilities. Multipath distortion happens when GPS signals bounce off nearby buildings or bodies of water and trick the receiver into reporting false elevation changes. But these coastal monitoring stations were specifically built on open bluffs and anchored in concrete precisely to minimize that kind of interference. And when engineers examined the multipath logs, they found clean patterns with no evidence of signal reflection, strong enough to fake a 6-foot vertical leap. Then there was phase unwrapping errors, which can occur in radar interferometry when the software that processes satellite data makes a calculation mistake and interprets a gentle slope as a vertical cliff. They ran phase coherence checks across hundreds of INSAR frames from different satellites. If this had been an algorithmic glitch, it would have shown up as isolated pixels or appeared along the edges of areas where the radar signal was weak. Instead, the vertical jump appeared as a perfect, unbroken line, stretching for hundreds of miles across every type of terrain, city blocks, farmland, rocky coastal headlands, all showing the exact same impossible shift. And that's when the real dread started to set in, because in geophysics, the gold standard is redundancy. A real geological signal has to appear in every independent measurement system you have. They compared ground-based GPS data with satellite radar readings and old-fashioned leveling surveys, and then they checked the tide gauges, which measure sea level relative to the land and should show the inverse of any genuine coastal uplift. Every single system told the same story. The tide gauges reported a sudden drop in water height that perfectly mirrored the rise measured on shore. Every instrument, every methodology, every independent network was in agreement about something that should not be possible. Harbor masters in Oakland and Port Hueneme were logging the same catastrophic reports. Commercial fishing boats designed to float at dock, now perched awkwardly above the waterline, with their hulls resting on mud, where the tide used to come in twice a day. The usual culprits that cause false readings, things like multipath interference, phase unwrapping errors, reference frame shifts, none of them could account for the scale or the consistency of what the instruments were reporting. With each additional cross-check the team performed, the list of potential explanations kept getting shorter. What they were left with was a signal that didn't match any known type of measurement error and didn't match any known natural geological process either. The idea that the land had genuinely lifted without any warning and without any identifiable cause just hung there in the lab. Impossible to prove, impossible to dismiss, and impossible to explain. But there was one case, one historical precedent that kept coming up in the emergency meetings. Back in 1956, a section of coastal bluff in Portuguese Bend, just south of Los Angeles, started to move in a way that terrified the residents who lived there. People woke up one morning to find cracks zigzagging across their lawns and streets. Over the next 7 months, that stretch of ground shifted more than 22 feet, and by the time spring arrived, 140 homes had been damaged or completely destroyed. The people who lived through it described the experience as being on a slow-motion conveyor belt that never actually stopped. It would pause and then lurch forward again whenever a heavy rainstorm hit the area. That landslide never fully stabilized. The ground just kept creeping along, sometimes moving only an inch or so per week, sometimes accelerating without much warning. Then in the winters of 2022 and 2023, California got hammered by storm systems that dropped more than double the normal rainfall. All that water soaked deep down into the clay layers beneath the hills, reactivating old sliding plains and pushing the groundwater tables up to levels that nobody alive had ever seen before. The monitoring sensors around Portuguese Bend started recording land movement at rates of up to 30 centimeters per week, 10 times faster than anything in the entire historical record for that location. The landslide zone expanded from about 380 acres to over 700 acres as it swallowed roads, homes, and neighborhoods. Geotechnical teams drilled new boreholes and discovered a deeper sliding layer that had been dormant for decades, but was now fully activated by the sheer weight and pressure of all that infiltrated water. The entire massive block of land was in motion deep underground, where the ancient clay layers were acting like a lubricant. And here's where Portuguese Bend became relevant to the mystery unfolding along the entire coast. At what geologists call the toe of a landslide, the leading edge where the moving earth meets resistance, something specific happens. As this enormous block of land grinds forward toward the ocean, the front edge slams into harder, more stable rock formations near the coast that won't budge. The result of all that compression is that the ground itself starts to buckle upward because it can't move forward anymore, so the only direction left is up. Engineers call it toe uplift, and it's been documented in landslide zones around the world where sensors have measured this kind of vertical bulging at rates ranging from a few millimeters to maybe a couple centimeters per year. Field research teams from JPL mapped the Portuguese Bend area extensively using GNSS and NSAR technology, tracking not just the horizontal slide, but the vertical pulse at the landslide's front edge. The patterns they found matched exactly what the textbooks predict. This kind of ground movement doesn't require a volcanic eruption or a major earthquake. It just needs water infiltrating the right kind of subsurface geology, gravity doing its relentless work, and the particular geometry of the coastal terrain. Some scientists started wondering, could this be it? Could there be massive landslides happening simultaneously along the entire California coast? But the theory fell apart almost immediately because Portuguese Bend is a localized phenomenon covering hundreds of acres at most, not hundreds of miles. The physics and mechanics that explain why toe uplift happens at a single landslide zone don't scale up to explain how 400 miles of coastline could rise uniformly in a single night. And while geologists were grappling with that dead end, the economic damage was accelerating beyond anyone's worst projections. Supply chain managers across the country were sending panicked messages to each other as they realized that fresh produce from Asia and critical electronics components needed for manufacturing were either going to spoil in containers or sit idle indefinitely. The ports weren't just temporarily disrupted, they were physically separated from the ocean with no timeline for when or if normal operations could resume. Shipping schedules that coordinate thousands of vessels and millions of tons of cargo were essentially shredded. The entire intricate system that keeps goods flowing into the American economy had seized up completely, and every hour that passed added billions more to the mounting losses. Then the institutional warfare started. A Silicon Valley-based satellite analytics company called GeoStride released their own independent analysis within hours of the initial reports. Their proprietary algorithms, processing data from commercial satellite constellations, showed the same 6-foot vertical displacement, but they claimed their measurements were even more precise than what the government networks were reporting. Almost immediately, the United States Geological Survey issued a rare public statement challenging GeoStride's findings. The USGS warned that satellite-only measurements can be distorted by atmospheric interference or introduced bias in processing algorithms. And they suggested that without ground truth validation from physical monuments, GeoStride's data couldn't be considered reliable. GeoStride's response was swift and pointed. They accused the USGS of institutional inertia, suggesting the agency was clinging to outdated ground-based sensor networks and refusing to acknowledge evidence that was plainly visible from orbital platforms. News organizations started publishing leaked internal emails that showed scientists on both sides were scrambling to defend not just their data, but their professional reputations. On social media, experts with competing institutional affiliations traded increasingly sharp criticisms about calibration protocols and whose methodology deserved to be trusted. And while this very public scientific war was escalating, people living along the coast were posting videos of mass strandings, desperate rescue attempts, and the eerie silence that had replaced the usual sound of waves reaching the shore. Behind the scenes, journalists were flooding both agencies with Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding access to raw data sets, internal communications, and any documentation that might hint at what was really happening. Some started pushing theories about classified military experiments, secret drilling operations, or underground nuclear tests that had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. The Department of Defense issued a terse statement denying any involvement, but the rumors kept spreading because there was no credible alternative explanation being offered. The scientific debate about what had caused the uplift was rapidly transforming into something uglier, a public battle over who gets to control the narrative about reality itself. Insurance companies watched their potential liability spike by billions of dollars. Policies that had been carefully written to cover damage from earthquakes or tsunamis were suddenly worthless because this event didn't fit any of the defined categories. The insurance industry was facing a disaster that had no name, no precedent, and no actuarial table to reference. Every major port facility along California's coast remained crippled. Docks that had been engineered for specific water depths were still high and dry, and maritime trade that represented a significant fraction of American imports was at a complete standstill. If the data was correct, then fundamental rules about how the Earth works had been violated, and everything geologists thought they understood about plate tectonics and crustal movement needed to be reconsidered. But if the data was somehow wrong despite passing every validation check, then it meant the world's most advanced and redundant monitoring networks had failed at their core function. With every new press release, technical rebuttal, and leaked document, the gap between the competing camps only widened. Nobody could say with any confidence what would happen next, or whether the coastline would continue rising, or stabilize, or maybe even reverse. What's documented beyond dispute is this: GPS measurements and INSAR satellite data confirm vertical land movement of up to 6 feet along more than 400 miles of California's coast in less than 24 hours. This is an event that has no parallel in any historical record or peer-reviewed scientific study at anywhere near this scale or speed. Investigators systematically ruled out sensor malfunction through cross-validated field audits and detailed reviews of original data files. The pattern of uplift doesn't match any known signature from earthquakes, volcanic activity, or landslide mechanics. While Portuguese Bend demonstrates that rapid uplift can definitely happen locally when specific conditions are met, nothing in published geological science can account for the geographic scope or the uniform timing of what's been observed. Official reports from the USGS and private sector firms remain contradictory, and several key data sets are still under internal review or have been classified for reasons that haven't been publicly explained. Ports remain shut down. Marine rescue teams continue working around the clock to save what they can of the coastal ecosystem. California is facing an unprecedented crisis that has no clear scientific explanation, no established response protocol, and no endpoint that anyone can predict. The cause of this coastal rise remains unproven. The question of what happens next is a matter of urgent inquiry that hasn't been settled. What we're left with is the unsettling reality that both the scientific foundations we rely on and the literal ground beneath millions of people's lives have never felt less certain.